The Long Roof. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to English churchyards on a weekday morning, before the dog walkers, and long before the tourists, when the frost is still deciding whether to become dew. It is not quiet of absence, it is a quiet of something listening back. Colin Ashworth had learned to love the quiet the way other men loved a pub or a football ground. It was, by now, the only silence he trusted. He arrived at St. Aldhelm's, Nethertow, a few minutes past 8, in a Vauxhall Astra the colour of bruise healing badly. 21 years old and held together, as far as anyone could tell, by rust and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. The exhaust announced him in full street before he did. He parked it half on a verge, the way he always did, nose towards the lynch gate, and sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. He always sat for a moment at first. It was not a superstition, he told himself. It was simply that a churchyard deserved a moment of stillness before a man went traipsing around it, with a camera bag over one shoulder and mud already collecting on the tread of his shoes. Colin was 34, though he had compressed, grey look of a man who had lived through several winters that hadn't agreed with him. His coat was good, an old wax jacket, once green, now the colour of a stagnant pond. But everything beneath it had slightly wrong fit of clothes brought for a body he used to have. He had not eaten properly in some time, and he had not slept properly in longer. His eyes had a glassy over-brightness of a man running on tea, nicotine, and something that was not quite purpose, but did the job of purpose reasonably well. He got out of the car. The door complained. He did not mind. The camera came out of its bag, with the reverence of a man holding something that was once saved his life, which, in a manner of speaking, it had. A Nikon, older than fashionable, newer than sentimental. Its strap gone soft and dark with years in his hands. He checked the battery, he checked the card. 41 gigabytes free, plenty. St. Aldham's was a modest church, Norman in its bones, Victorian in its restoration, the kind of building that appeared on no postcard and in no guidebook, and existed simply because a village had once needed somewhere to put its dead, and had never quite gotten out of that habit. The yard sloped gently away from the porch, headstones leaning at various angles that 200 years of frost will produce, some upright and proud, some subsided into the turf like old men settling into armchairs. Colin began, as he always began, at the light gate, and worked his way in a slow clockwise spiral, the way a man might read a room he suspected of holding something he could not yet see. He took a photograph of a lichen-encrusted angel, wings chipped, one hand raised in a blessing that had eroded into something closer to a warning. He took a photograph of a child's grave, 1847, aged 3 years and 4 months, flanked by 2 stone lambs, one of which had lost its head to time or vandalism. He had never been able to decide which was crueler. He took a photograph of a table tome sunk so deep into the ground that only its lid remained visible, like the last plate on a sinking ship. He did not photograph anything else, not the church tower against the low winter sun, though it would have been a fine picture, not the yew tree, ancient and split and still somehow alive, though 100 amateur photographers had made 100 careers out of yew trees like it. He photographed graves, only graves, headstones, curbstones, ledger stones, the odd broken cross, 200 photographs, sometimes 300, in a single morning, methodical as a surveyor, patient as a man who had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. If anyone had asked him, and in 11 years almost no one had, he would have said he was documenting something, local history perhaps, a record before the stone was smooth and the names went with them. It was, on the surface, a perfectly respectable and faintly dull hobby, the sort of thing retired schoolteachers did for the parish newsletter. He did not publish a single one. Not on a blog, not on a forum for genealogists, though God knew there were people out there who would have paid him for half of what sat unlabelled on his hard drives. Not even, in the loosest and most modern sense, on social media, where a man with his eye for the eerie and crumbling could easily have found an audience hungry for exactly this sort of atmosphere. They were his. That was the whole of the reasoning, when he examined it, which he tried not to do too often. He had found something, years before, that had very nearly cost him his mind to look at directly, and in the strange arithmetic he had built for himself since, the photographs were his payment for having survived it, his collection, his alone. To share them felt, in some way he could never quite articulate to himself, like handing round the contents of another man's coffin for people to comment on. So he took the pictures and he left, and nobody in Nethertow that morning gave him a second glance, except from a woman walking a spaniel who watched him for a moment through the church railings and thought, not unkindly, that he looked like a man who had been rained on for several years running. It had started, as these things often do in the tellings men give themselves afterwards, with something so small he had almost deleted it. 11 years ago Colin had been, in every outward respect, an unremarkable man, a technician for a company that serviced photocopiers, a hobbyist photographer who preferred landscapes to people because landscapes did not require him to make conversation. He had gone to Yorkshire on a long weekend, alone, because he had always gone everywhere alone, and had photographed a churchyard near Harworth for no reason than there was there and the light was good. It was 3 days later, scrolling through the take on a laptop with a mug of tea going cold at his elbow, that he found it. A shape, just off the edge row of a set of headstones, half swallowed by the shadow of a U, at the exact periphery of the frame where a careless photographer would never have thought to look, and a careful one might have dismissed as noise, or a smear on the lens, or simply a trick of the eyes play when they are tired and looking too hard for shapes in dark places. Except it was not noise. He had zoomed in, badly, the resolution falling apart into blocky uselessness, and there had been, unmistakably, but one photograph and one photograph only out of the 211 he had taken that day, the suggestion of a figure. Tall, thin in the way that suggested absence rather than leanness, standing there where no one had been standing, in a churchyard he remembered, with the specific and total clarity of hindsight, as having been entirely empty. He had not slept that night. He told himself it was the fault of the censor. He went back to Yorkshire 11 days later. He photographed the same churchyard, the same angle, as close as he could reconstruct it from memory. Nothing. He went back a third time, a month after that, on a whim he did not examine too closely. And this time there was something at the Ligate, small, distant, an old woman's shape perhaps, gone entirely by the next frame, and Colin Ashworth had sat down on a wet curbstone in the middle of a Yorkshire graveyard, and put his head in his hands and understood, with the sudden total certainty of a man who has discovered the shape of the rest of his life, that something had changed in him, or around him, or both, and that it was not going to unchange. What followed over the next year, he came to think of it privately as his education. He learned through trial, through failure, through developing what could be described as the kind of patience he had never possessed before, that he was simply not lucky, or simply cursed, but sensitive to something, in a way that seemed, as far as he was ever able to determine, to be entirely unique to him. He took a photography club acquaintance to a churchyard he knew held something, and photographed it themselves on an identical camera, side by side with him, same setting, same moment. Nothing showed on their card, something showed, faint but present, on his. He never told the acquaintance why he wanted the comparison. He never told anyone anything, ever again, if he could help it. It was not a gift, he decided, somewhere in the first difficult year, that he had ever asked for or would have chosen, but it was his, and it was real. And this was the part that mattered. The part that had calcified over a decade into something like religious conviction. It meant that he, and apparently only he, was in a position to see what was standing at the edges of England's quietest and most forgotten places, watching whatever it is the dead watch, waiting for whatever it is the dead wait for. Someone had to notice them, he had come to believe. Someone had to keep the record. It might as well be the man nobody else would have picked for the job. He did not think of himself as haunted, he thought of himself as deputized. By the time he reached the second churchyard that morning, St. Albans had been a warm-up, a limbering up of the eye. He always did 2 or 3 sights in a day when he could. The light had gone flat and grey in the way that November light in the north of England so often does, as though the sky had simply given up trying. The village was called Nethertow, though village flattered it. It was perhaps 400 residents left, a single shop that doubled as a post office, and a war memorial with more names on it than the current population might comfortably have managed to lose in a second conflict, had one come. Colin had passed through it twice before on other business and noted, the way a man notes weather, that the churchyard here was substantial, far larger than the village it served, sprawling back into a stand of old beech and sycamore that marked the edge of what had once been, presumably, common land. He parked the Astra outside the light gate, and he got the camera out. He began. The graveyard was, in its way, one of the loveliest he had photographed all year. Old stone, well weathered, the inscription still mostly legible where the newer Victorian sections met the older, more haphazard medieval ground near the church. He worked his slow spiral, unhurried, the shutter clicking with the soft regularity of a man's own pulse, and it was perhaps 40 minutes into the visit, near the back boundary where the graveyard gave way to the tree line, that he lowered the camera to rest on his arm. Doing so, glanced up towards the trees themselves. There was nothing there. He wants that understood later, when he tries to reconstruct it for himself. There was, in the moment of looking with his naked eye, absolutely nothing at the tree line but trees, bare-branched, indifferent, dripping with the last of the morning's frost into the leaf litter beneath them. He raised the camera again out of habit more than intention. Framed the row of graves nearest the boundary, with the tree line behind them for context. The way he sometimes did to place a section within the wider yard, and took the shot. He did not look at it straight away. He rarely did, in the field. He preferred to review the day's work in the evening, with tea and with the curtains drawn, in the particular concentration he reserved for that hour. But something, he could not afterwards say what, some small wrongness at the edge of attention, the kind of thing a man senses in a room before he can say why, made him thumb the little screen on the back of the camera before he had even lowered it from his eye. There were figures at the tree line. Not 1, 3, perhaps 4. The resolution and the distance made the exact count difficult, and he would spend, over the following weeks, an unreasonable number of hours trying to pin the number down, as though it mattered, as though 4 ghosts were somehow more manageable proposition than 3, standing in a loose, unhurried cluster just inside the tree line, in the gap between 2 beeches. In a spot he was entirely certain had been empty a moment before, both in the world and, he was nearly sure, in the frame before this one. They were facing him. He had seen shapes before, over 11 years, dozens of them by now, a private catalogue of a shadow, the absence that lived on 3 separate hard drives he kept, out of some instinct he had never questioned, in 3 separate locations. Most of them did not even seem to notice him at all. They stood or knelt, or in one memorable and deeply unpleasant instance, appeared to be scratching at the base of its own headstone, entirely absorbed in whatever business the dead conduct among themselves, indifferent to the living man 40 feet away from the camera. These 4 were not indifferent. Even in the low resolution of the review screen, even at the distance, there was something in the set of them, a stillness that was not the passive stillness of the others, but a directed one, an attention that told him, with the flat certainty of a man reading a room, that they knew he was there and that they were looking back. He took 3 more photographs in quick succession, his hands, he noticed distantly, no longer entirely steady. In the second, the figures had not moved, and in the third, they seemed, though he told himself for days afterwards, that this was almost certainly a trick of light and low resolution and his own frayed nerve, to have taken a single collective step forward, out from between the beeches into the open grass of the churchyard's edge. He did not take a 4th photograph. He lowered the camera and made himself look with his naked eyes directly at the spot. There was nothing there. Bare trees, dripping frost. A magpie went over, low and loud, and the ordinary sound of it and the ordinary grey morning was almost enough to convince him he had imagined the whole thing. Almost. He packed up his kit with more haste than dignity and drove away from Nethertow with his hands very tight on the wheel, and did not, for once, stop for his customary sandwich at the next town along. He came back to Nethertow 6 days later, not to the churchyard but to the library, a squat brick building in the market town 4 miles up the road, the kind of place with a laminated sign about a Tuesday morning coffee and local history section consisting of 2 shelves and the goodwill of a semi-retired volunteer named, as it turns out, Mrs. Pemberton. Colin had working theory by then, developed over 6 sleepless nights of looking at the same 3 photographs until the shapes in them had stopped looking like anything at all. The theory was this: in 11 years, the figures he encountered were almost, without exception, solitary, indifferent, and anchored. So far, as he had been able to determine, to a single grave or to a single small cluster of graves. What he had photographed at Nethertow was neither solitary nor, in the last photograph, indifferent. Whatever this was, it was a different in kind, not merely in scale, and Colin Ashworth's entire 11-year education had taught him that when something in a churchyard behaved differently, there was, almost always, a story behind it which the living had simply stopped telling. Nethertow, Mrs. Pemberton said, in the tone of a woman revisiting an old ache. Now there's a place that's had more than its fair share. She was 70-something, cardiganed, entirely undaunted by a stranger's interest in local misfortune. If anything, faintly grateful for it. The way people in fading places often are when someone from outside finally asks. She led him to 2 shelves, drew down a slim, self-published paperback with a faded photograph of a colliery headstock on the cover, and set in front of him with a particular care people reserve for objects that matter more than their appearance suggests. Shadow under Nethertow, the history of the colliery and its people, by a local historian named R.J. Fothergill, published, according to the copyright page, in 1987, by nobody Colin had ever heard of, in a print run that had almost certainly never exceeded a few hundred copies. There was a boarding house, Mrs. Pemberton said, settling into the chair opposite with the ease of a woman glad of the company. Up on the fell road, for the men who worked the pit and didn't have family nearby the house. Sister's house, they called it. Nobody rightly remembers why. Some story about nuns having had a hospice there centuries before, though it's never been proved. It's long gone now. Foundations, if you know where to look. And the pit, Colin said. Closed in 84, she said, along with half the pits in the country that year. But Nethertow's had gone before most, and it went for a worse reason than the government's. She tapped the book. It's all in there. I'll leave you to it. Take as long as you like, love. We're not exactly rushed off our feet. He read for 2 hours without moving, the library closing around him in that particular hush that libraries reserve for people who are clearly not to be disturbed. The account, in Fothergill's plain, careful prose, laid it out with the flat patience of a man who had simply interviewed the last of the old miners before they had died, and had wanted, more than anything, simply to get it written down before it was lost. The Nethertow colliery had never been large by the standards of the great Yorkshire and Durham pits, but it had been on the whole the village's living for the better part of a century, 3 generations of the same families going down the same shaft, and in December 1954, a roof fall in the deep west workings, a section the men had apparently been uneasy about for months, according to testimony Fothergill had gathered decades later from surviving relatives, had caved in without warning during the afternoon shift and taken 11 men with it. 11 names, Colin found himself, without quite deciding to, copying them into the notebook he kept for exactly this purpose, in the small, careful hand of a man used to recording things precisely. Names that meant nothing to him and, he suspected, meant less and less each year to anyone still living in Nethertow. Hartley, Iverson, 2 brothers named Rudd, a boy of 17 named Barraclough, who had been down the pit only 4 months. The rescue, such as it was, had taken 3 days. The bodies, when finally recovered, had been buried together over successive days in the churchyard in St Aldham's, though Fothergill, as careful to note, in a sentence Colin read 3 times, that not all 11 had been laid in the same plot. The colliery owners, in a decision the book described with barely restrained bitterness as characteristic of the era's distinctions, had arranged and paid for a modest memorial section near the boundary trees with the ordinary miners, while the families of the 2 under-managers men who had, in fairness to the historical record, gone down with the rescue attempt rather than the initial fall, were buried near the church itself, in the older, more respectable ground, at the company's rather grander expense. Colin looked up from the book, and thought of the tree line, and the figures standing just inside it, in the gap between the beeches, at the exact edge of what once, he had no proof yet, but he did not need proof to feel the shape of it settling over him like cold water, have been the boundary of the miners' section. He copied out the 11 names again, more carefully this time, and then went looking, with a new and specific hunger, for something the book might say about where, precisely, each of the 2 under-managers had been buried. He found himself, over the following fortnight, spending more time in Nethertow than the churchyard alone accounted for, in the particular way a man convinces himself he is merely being thorough when he is, in fact, unable to stop thinking about something. He noticed, on his 3rd or 4th visit, the way he had not noticed on his first, the village had the quality of a photograph slightly out of focus. Not run down exactly, nothing so dramatic as boarded windows or broken glass, but tired, in a way that seemed to sit at the very stone of it. The shop's awnings had faded from what once must have been a cheerful blue to something closer to the colour of an old bruise. The War Memorial's brass plaque wanted polishing. The pub, there was remarkably still a pub, the Miners' Rest, its sign a faded painting of which Colin found he could no longer look at directly without a small cold turn in his stomach, kept hours so irregular that they twice found it shut at times the pub in a living village would surely have been open. The people, when he saw them, were mostly old. He counted. On one slow circuit of the high street with a coffee he'd bought more for the excuse to linger than any real thirst, 4 pensioners, a postman and a single child, perhaps 8 years old, being walked to a car by a grandmother rather than a parent, at 3:30 on a school day, in a manner that suggested this was simply how things were done here, now, rather than any particular emergency. There was a new build estate on the village's northern edge. He discovered it on a longer drive around, 11 houses, brick and 2 bright orange-red, of genuinely recent construction, and a sign, weathered already despite its youth, advertising 4 or 5 bedroom family homes, now selling. 3 of the 11 had cars on the drive. The rest sat with their curtains open into empty rooms, waiting for a demand that did not, it seemed, exist. It struck him, sitting in the Astra outside those unsold houses, with the engine ticking as it cooled, that Nethertow had the specific, particular stillness of a wound that had never quite closed. Not a dead place, there were still lights on, still a shop, still the small ordinary business of living going forward in its diminished way, but a place that had taken a blow 70 years before, and then a second blow 30 years after that when the pit had finally closed for good, and had simply never found its feet again. The young left, as the young do everywhere pits close and nothing replaces them, and did not come back, and the ones who stayed grew old together in the village, built for 3 times their number, and the churchyard, Colin thought, with a small cold clarity that felt less like deduction and more like something being handed to him, was perhaps the only part of Nethertow that had not shrunk at all. If anything, over 70 years, it had nothing to do but grow. He thought of the boy, Barraclough, 17 years old, 4 months into his first job, and wondered whether anyone currently living in Nethertow still spoke his name aloud, for any reason at all, or whether the record Fothergill had made in 1987 was the last time it had been said out loud with any weight behind it. He suspected he now knew what a churchyard looked like when a town had simply stopped, quietly, at some point decades before, and never told itself so out loud. He tried once to talk to someone about it. Not the figures, never the figures, but the town itself, the strange arrested quality of the place. He fell into conversation with the postman, a broad, unhurried man named Jeff, who was refuelling at the same forecourt pump, and seemed glad enough of someone new to talk to. "Used to be you couldn't get a house here for love nor money," Jeff said, when Colin asked, careful, obliquely, whether the village had always been this quiet. "My dad worked the pit. Everyone's dad worked the pit, or their granddad. When it went, it just..." He made a small gesture with one hand, a kind of collapsing, not unlike, Colin thought with a chill he did not show, the collapsing of a roof. Nobody left all at once. That's the thing people get wrong when they think about places like this. It's not a bomb going off. It's more like everyone just quietly decides, one at a time, over about 30 years, that there's no reason for their kids to stay. And then one day you look up and it's all old folk and empty houses, and a shop that you can't justify a second till. Does it bother the people, living with it? Jeff had looked at him oddly then. The particular look of man being asked a question he had never once thought to ask himself. Living with what exactly? Colin had not had an answer that would not have sounded mad, and had let the conversation die there, thanked the man and driven on. But the phrase stayed with him for days afterward. Nobody left all at once, turning over and over in his mind alongside the image of 4 figures at a tree line, patient, unhurried, in absolute no rush at all to be anywhere else. He went back to St. Oldham 7 times over the following month. He could not, in honesty, have been able to say exactly why 7, except that some private accounting in him had settled on it as a number of visits required before he trusted a pattern rather than a coincidence. They were there every time. Not always visible to the naked eye. Twice standing at the boundary himself in broad daylight with a camera hanging forgotten at his chest, he saw nothing at all and half convinced himself the whole episode had been a fluke of tired eyes and bad light. But the camera had never failed to find them. 3 figures, sometimes 4, clustered at the tree line in the gap between the beeches, and on every visit after the second, without exception, closer to the boundary than they had ever been to visit before. A matter of a yard or 2 each time, he calculated, cross-referencing against the fixed grave marker he had begun using as a measuring point, the way a geologist might watch a glacier. He mapped the churchyard properly on his 5th visit, pacing it out with a hardware shop tape measure, and sketching the layout in the back of his notebook with the flat precision of a surveyor, because Fothergill's book, for all its careful research, had been frustratingly vague on exactly where the 2 boundaries, miners section, management section, actually fell within the modern yard. It did not take him long to confirm what he had already, in some quieter part of himself, known since the library. The tree line and the figures gathered against it sat directly behind and beyond the plainest, oldest, most weathered row of stones in the entire churchyard. Small uniform markers, many of them illegible now, clearly bought in a batch by a colliery company keen to be seen to have done the decent thing as cheaply as decency allowed. He found, with some difficulty, kneeling in wet grass with a torch on a grey afternoon, 4 stones bearing 4 of the 11 names from his notebook. Hartley, one of the Rudd brothers, and Barraclough, the stone smaller than the others, as though even in death the boy had been allotted less. Iverson. He did not find the graves of the 2 under-managers anywhere near them. Those he found instead nearer the church porch, on the older, better tended ground. Proper granite, proper lettering, still crisp enough after 70 years to read without a torch. Thomas Ray Aldous, under-manager, Nethertow Colliery, entered into rest 1971, aged 68 years. Beloved husband and father. Beside him, a similar stone of a man named Selwood, died in 1968, aged 71. Both had lived long, respectable lives after the disaster. Both had died. As Fothergill's book confirmed in a footnote, Colin had somehow skimmed past the first time, of nothing more sinister than an ordinary wear of old age, decades after the roof came down. which left him kneeling in the wet grass of St. Aldham's with his notebook open and a torch going dim in his hand, turning over a question that felt, the longer he sat with it, less like a curiosity and more like the edge of something he had not yet properly understood. The men buried nearest the boundary, the ones who had died in the fall, whose grim work it had genuinely been to be crushed beneath a mile of collapsing stone, showed no sign, in 11 visits now, of restlessness. They lay where they lay. Whatever haunted this churchyard was not haunting from their graves at all. It was Aldous and Selwood, the two managers, the two men who had, by every account he could find, behaved with genuine courage on the day of the collapse, and gone on afterward to live long, comfortable, unremarkable lives, dying peacefully in their beds decades later, whose section, if it could be called that, seemed to sit closest to whatever was gathering at the trees. He did not understand it. He wrote it down anyway, in a careful hand of a man building a case he did not yet know how to argue. There was a further detail, one he almost missed, tucked into a longer paragraph about the aftermath of the inquest that followed the collapse. Fothergill, working from testimony given decades after the fact by men who had been young at the time and were themselves old or dead by the time he came to interview them, noted that resentment in the village toward the colliery's management had run high in the years immediately following 1954, and had never entirely subsided, even by the time of the pit's closure 30 years later. The official inquiry had found no individual culpable. The roof fall was attributed, in the dry language of the period, to unforeseeable geological conditions, but Fothergill recorded, with the careful neutrality of a historian reporting rather than endorsing a grievance, that many in the village had believed, and some had gone to their own graves believing, that warnings given by the men working the Deep West section in the weeks before the collapse had been heard by management and set aside in the interests of output. The two under-managers who died in the rescue attempt were on record as having personally overruled a request to shore up the section a fortnight before it fell. Colin sat with that for a long time, in the quiet of his own kitchen, the book open in front of him, and his tea gone entirely cold. It did not, on its own, explain figures gathering at the tree line 11 years into this own strange education, closing the distance a yard at a time across 70 years of patient waiting. But it went some way, he thought, toward explaining why two men who had, by every surviving account, behaved bravely on the day itself, and who had gone to live long, undisturbed, and by all appearances entirely peaceful lives afterward, might nonetheless lie at the centre of whatever unfinished business still moved through the churchyard. Courage, on one day, it occurred to him, did not undo a fortnight of a request refused. The dead, in his experience now spanning 11 years and more churchyards than he could easily count, did not appear to keep the books quite the way the living like to keep them. He wrote that thought down too, and then, because it troubled him more than he wanted to admit, he closed the notebook, and went back to Fothergill's book that same evening looking, this time, for anything at all that the historian might have said about the second graveyard. He found it on page 140, in a passage he had skimmed too quickly the first time through, more interested than the names and dates than Fothergill's occasional aside about the town's geography. The parish churchyard, the passage read. Colin transcribed it into the notebook that night, word for word, something he almost never bothered doing, was by 1954 already crowded, and it should be noted that a number of the mining families, particularly those of nonconformist or dissenting background, had for some decades preferred burial in the newer municipal ground established at the town's eastern edge, adjoining what had once been the pit's own row of tied cottages. This ground, locally referred to even now as Pit Row, or occasionally the Common Ground, received a number of burials connected with the 1954 disaster, in addition to those interred at St. Aldham's, and it was here, rather than at the parish church, that the bulk of the bereaved families themselves, wives, children, parents of the dead, came in time to be buried alongside their men. Colin read the passage 4 times before he closed the book. Pit Row, when he found it on the map 2 days later, sat exactly where Fothergill described, a scrubby municipal cemetery on the town's eastern fringe, unconnected to any church, The kind of ground local councils had opened up in the industrial 19th century when parish churchyards could simply no longer hold the dead their parishes were producing. It was, according to the satellite view on his phone, considerably larger than St. Aldham's, and considerably less tended. Its access marked only by a narrow lane that seemed to serve no other purpose. He told himself, driving out to it 3 mornings later, that this was simply the next logical step in his research, a second site connected to the same disaster, a photographer's due diligence. He knew within 30 seconds of getting out of the car that this was not going to be like St. Aldham's. There was no latchgate here, no gentle Victorian order. A low iron gate, rusted nearly shut, hung between 2 brick gate posts that had once, perhaps, borne the name in ironwork letters, most of which had long since fallen away or been stolen for scrap. Only a single curling P remained. Beyond it, the ground rose in an uneven swell towards a scrubby line of hawthorn, headstones scattered across it in no discernible order that Colin's surveyor's eyes could find. Some crowded 3 and 4 to a family plot, no larger than a garden bed. Others standing entirely alone in stretches of rough grass that had clearly not been cut in months. The quiet here was different, and it took him a moment, standing at the rusted gate with his camera, bag heavy over his shoulder, to place exactly how. St. Aldham's, even at its most unsettling, had carried a quiet that felt, at bottom, sorrowful, a held breath, a grief grown old and patient. This was not that. This felt, if a silence could be said to feel anything at all, like a held breath before something is said that cannot be taken back. He had, in 11 years, learned to trust that particular instinct absolutely. He very nearly turned around. He did not turn around, he told himself, pushing the gate open with a shriek of old metal that seemed obscenely loud in that flat, waiting stillness. That he had come this far, that Fothergill's book had led him here for a reason, that this, whatever this was precisely the kind of forgotten, undocumented ground his entire self-appointed duty existed to record. Someone had to notice. It might as well be him. He walked in. The names, where he could read them at all, told him quickly enough that he had found what Fothergill had promised. Hartley again, a different Christian name, a wife perhaps, or a mother. A cluster of rudstones, 4 together, a family plot crowded with the grief the way St. Aldham's had never allowed itself to be crowded. And, near the centre of the ground, on a stone gone dark with lichen, but still legible if you crouched close, 3 names together on a single marker, a wife and 2 children, dated within 11 days of each other, in December of 1954. The wife's cause of death unrecorded on the stone itself, but requiring, Colin thought, standing over it with a notebook forgotten in his hand, no historian to explain. He became aware, somewhere in the reading of that stone, that he had not raised his camera once since arriving. In 11 years, he had never once entered a churchyard and failed to begin working within minutes. He raised it now, with hands that were, he noted at the same distant, clinical part of himself that had once catalogued 4 figures at the tree line, no longer entirely steady, and found that some part of him did not want to. Some part of him, the part of him that learned, over a decade, to trust the specific texture of a silence, was telling him, with a plainness that felt less like instinct now, and more like something that communicated to him directly, that he was not welcome here, that whatever St. Albans had tolerated in an outsider with a camera, Pitt Road did not intend to tolerate at all. He raised the camera anyway. He told himself it was his duty. He was no longer entirely sure that was the truth. He chose, in the end, the family stone, the wife, the 2 children, December 1954, because it seemed, of everything in the crowded, unhappy ground, the one of the whole Pitt Road's griefs most plainly pointed to. He framed it carefully, the way he framed everything, kneeling slightly to catch the stone without the sky washing out behind it. The hawthorn line a dark smear at the top of the shot. He took the photograph. He turned the camera to check the frame, an old habit now, sharpened brutally new since Nethertow, before he had even fully lowered it from his eye. The screen was full of them. Not 3, not 4. He would never afterward be able to give an honest count, and the not knowing would trouble him more, in quiet moments, than almost anything else about the morning. But the loose crowd of shapes that filled the frame from one edge to the other, standing among and between and in places that made his stomach turn over entirely, seemingly through the headstones nearest him. It was not a handful, it was a churchyard's worth. It was, he understood with a cold and total clarity, the whole of Pit Row's dead, or near enough as made no difference, and every one of them, in that single frozen frame, was facing directly toward the camera. Toward him. He looked up from the screen. There was nothing there. Grass, stone, the hawthorn line, indifferent, unmoved. He looked back down at the screen, some part of him needing, even now, even with his pulse going hard in his throat, to confirm what he had seen. And the shapes had moved. Closer. Not by much, a yard, perhaps 2, and a whole loose crowd of them shifted forward as one, the way a tide moves, unhurried and entirely certain of arriving. He did not check a third time. He does not remember afterward deciding to run. He remembers the gait, the shriek of rusted iron under his shoulder, harder than the situation strictly required, the camera banging hard against his hip on its strap, the bag left behind on the grass where it had fallen from his shoulder and which he could not and would not go back for. He remembers the lane, uneven under his boots, his breath tearing at him in a way 11 years of stress and poor diet had made humiliatingly easy. He remembers reaching the Astra and fumbling for the key twice before he caught, pulling away from the pit row with the door not properly shut, gravel spitting under from the tyres, not looking in the mirror once, not once at all the way back to the main road. He did not stop until he was 4 miles clear, in a lay-by outside a village he did not recognise, engine running, both hands locked on the wheel, breathing in great uneven pulls that fogged the windscreen faster than the heater could clear. It was some minutes before he trusted himself to look at the camera again. When he finally did, screen trembling slightly in his grip, though whether the camera shook or his hands did, he could no longer have said. The photograph was exactly as he remembered it. The crowd facing him, closer than they had any right to be, in a single frame than the previous frame had shown. He did not delete it. In 11 years, whatever else had changed in him, it never once deleted a photograph. And some stubborn, unbending part of him would not let that record break now, of all moments. He simply closed the little screen and sat, and did not move again for the better part of an hour. He did not go back to Nethertow. He told himself, in the weeks that followed, a number of things, that Fothergill's book had said it all it had to say, that 11 names copied into a notebook constituted a completed record, and that a man in a position had a duty to move on to the next forgotten place, rather than dwell too long in one that had made its feelings about him plain. He believed, perhaps, a third of it. He did not go back for his camera bag either, in the end. Though it nagged at him for weeks in the particular, disproportionate way small unfinished things do. He bought a new one. It did not feel the same on his shoulder. Nothing much in that period felt the same. 3 weeks after Pit Row, a man who had known him from the photocopier trade years before, running into him entirely by chance in a service station forecourt near Skipton, would later describe Colin to his wife as having looked, and he used the word deliberately, unwell. Grey around the eyes in a way that went beyond simple tiredness, thinner than a man his height had any business being. His hands, the acquaintance noticed with a small private unease he did not examine too closely, not quite steady around the cup of coffee. They had spoken for perhaps 4 minutes. Colin had not mentioned graveyards, or Nethertow, or anything at all about the 11 years that had brought him to that forecourt looking the way he looked. He had talked, briefly and without much conviction, about the weather and driven on. He did not stop taking photographs. That, if anything else in his life held its shape, held. He did once, in that grey stretch of weeks, take the 3 hard drives out of the drawer where he kept them and lay them side by side on his kitchen table, and sit looking at them for a long time without opening any of them. 11 years of quiet, patient work, thousands of stones, dozens of shapes, most of them solitary, most of them indifferent, waiting in their small private grief at the edges of the frames nobody but him would ever see. He had told himself for 11 years that the work was a duty, that someone had to notice what stood watching at the borders of England's forgotten places, and that it might as well be a man nobody else would have chosen for the job. He still believed that, sitting in his own kitchen table with his tea going cold, the way it so often did now. He believed it perhaps a little more grimly than he had once. And he no longer entirely trusted himself to say where the duty ended and something closer to a summons began. But he believed it all the same, and put the drives away, and he did not delete a single frame. 5 weeks after Pit Row, a woman walking her dog past the churchyard in St. Bartholomew's, on the edge of the former mill town some 60 miles from Nethertow, a town that had once run on cotton and cloth the way Netherstow had run on coal, and had fared, in the long years since the last mill closed, only marginally better, noticed a man working his way in a slow, careful spiral through the older section of the yard, a camera raised to his eye every step, methodical as a man counting something that mattered a great deal to him. He looked, she thought, rather unwell, grey and thin, and dishevelled in a particular way of a man who had stopped noticing his own reflection some time before. There was an old car parked half on the verge outside the gate, dented and rust-caked, 20 years old if it was a day, its engine still ticking faintly as it cooled. She did not speak to him. There seemed, somehow, without her being able to quite say why, no reason to disturb him. He worked on, unhurried, patient, from one weathered stone to the next, the shutter clicking briefly in the flat grey morning. A town's worth of forgotten dead, waiting, as they had always had, to be seen by someone, and a man who had long ago stopped being able to walk away from that particular kind of quiet, working his way steadily, methodically, toward whatever waited for him at the edge of the trees. He took his pictures, and did not stop until he was done.